Awesome. Okay, so. All right, so tonight we continue our study on walking by faith. And so this week I'll be presenting Moses, and we'll switch over, and Matt will take over in the next couple of weeks. So with that being said, let's get right into our study today. So last week we talked about faith by Isaac. We also talked about faith by Jacob and Joseph. In fact, we covered Hebrews 11, verse 20 through 22. We learned the measure of their faith of each one of those patriarchs. And we made this distinct connection that those patriarchs had one thing in common, and that was the fact that they all died not having received the full extent of the promises of God. And yet still they believed. And so with that being said, that brings us to the focus of our study today. And so for those of you that know the story of Moses, it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And I'm so excited to be here today and to talk to you about Moses. And so if you would you please turn with me to Hebrews 11, verse 23 through 29. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover, sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea. When the people crossed the Red Sea as dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, drowned. So now let's switch our focus to Hebrews 11, verse 23. See, at this point, following where we left off last week, following the death of Joseph, the Israelites, at this point, 400 years had passed, and their numbers have grown so large that, in fact, they outnumber the Egyptians. And so the king of the time, the Pharaoh, in his way to control the numbers of the Israelites, as we know God had opened their wombs, that he makes a command. And the command was to kill all of the firstborn sons of the Hebrews by casting them into the river. And also, he also seeks to control them by treating them as if they were mere cattle and casting them into slavery. And so that leads us into this verse where it says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. Now, let me ask this question. Who did the concealment? Who was responsible for hiding Moses? No, not. There was the parents. The parents, and specifically, which parent hid Moses? Which of the parents hid Moses? The mother. The mother, because in Exodus 2, verse 2, we hear of this account where the mother gives birth to Moses, and she puts Moses into this basket full of bulrushes, bitumen, and sends Moses down the river. Now, I want to also make this point that to live in a place where your firstborn son could be subject to execution is a hard thing to endure. So it was a difficult thing at the time for these Hebrews, these Israelites. And so Moses' mom sees this baby, and I'm sure that when you have a baby, you have love. They love the baby. And so they noticed something about the baby. What did they notice about the baby? It was beautiful. In fact, it had this unusual beauty to it, in that they had a plan. They wanted to save this baby because they felt as though God might have had a great plan for this baby. This baby might have been destined for something great. And so they want to save this baby. Not that the Hebrews were not also doing the same thing. In fact, it could have been very well some of these families were attempting to do the very thing that the parents of Moses were trying to do. And so they see this baby that is pretty, that is handsome, that is beautiful, and they want to save it because they feel as though God has a plan. So what do? They put Moses in a river. Now, we could also speculate that the mother, who is responsible for the concealment, after 3 months, the baby grows and they have to make a decision because it's getting bigger. And so they say, okay, we can speculate that they went out into the river and saw the daughter of Pharaoh frequenting a certain part of the river. And they must have came up with a plan to save this baby. And they said, okay, what if we send this baby down this river and someone picks up this baby, and in hopes of sparing the life of Moses, that the person that picks Moses up has compassion. And so later on, who do we find out picks up Moses? Pharaoh's daughter. So Pharaoh's daughter picks up Moses, and she immediately has compassion on the baby. But guess who was standing afar watching this whole thing unfold? Who was watching everything unfold? The sister. So the sister comes in, and what does she do? She asks, do you need a nurse? And then she says, yes. And then she goes and gets her mom, who is the mother of Moses, and what happens? She is employed to take care of her own son. Isn't that amazing, the work of God? How God puts his plan into place. And so in Acts 7, verse 20, is when we learn that they saw that the baby was beautiful. Does anybody have any comments? Anything that they want to add?
Augustine?
Yes.
I find it amazing that Pharaoh's decree to heal the baby, it's from his house.
Yes.
That redemption comes. And in some regard, obviously God's providing the redemption, but it's coming through Pharaoh's house, Pharaoh's daughter.
And that actually leads me into my next point, because the last part of this verse says that they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, when you think about it, if you're a slave and you're living in anywhere and the king says something, there has to be some kind of a punishment if you disobey. But in this regard, they were not afraid. Let me ask this. Why were they not afraid of the king's edict? Because we learn just looking back, the king says that when the midwives were to attend to the Hebrews during pregnancy, that they were to cast them into the Nile River. And so if you obey, there is a level of punishment, even death. But in this case, the parents of Moses were not afraid. Why is that? They had faith in God. They had faith. They had their full confidence that God would spare this baby. And guess what happens? God works, and Moses' life is spared. Any comments, any thoughts? Yes.
I know we can't compare ourselves and our circumstances with what God was doing with Moses, but I believe when we pray in faith, God providentially works things out for us. And I've seen that so many times in my life, 60 years as a Christian, how that works. And you just take it for granted after a while, but you still have to pray believing and asking for God's help.
That's right.
And he works things out. All things work together for the good of those that love God and are called.
If you didn't hear, Jack said that if you pray that God works providentially in our lives and You know, I'm glad that you made that point because at the end of this lesson, I have something that goes along this line that I want to share with us. So thank you for bringing that up. So let's move further along. In verse 24, it says, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So reading this verse immediately brings me to this question, and that is, at what age does Moses decide to make this decision? At what age does Moses decide that he was going to visit his brethren? Does anybody know what age he was? In Acts 7, there's, in fact, where it all plays out, Stephen's response to a false accusation that was brought against him, that he had spoken against Moses in the temple. And yet, instead of defending himself, he makes a defense of the Old Testament gospel. And he says in Acts 7, verse 23, that when he was 40, so in referencing to Moses, when Moses was 40, he decided to visit his people. And it's interesting that he says his people. Because all along, at this point, at the age of 40, we can also make the argument that Moses grows up in the home of Pharaoh because he was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh. And so on this side, you have him learning the tradition of the Egyptian culture. And on the other side, guess who was there? His mom. His mom could have easily told him, you grew up in Egypt, but guess what? You were not an Egyptian. You were Hebrew. And so she must have told him about the promises of God, about the promise that was made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so Moses grows up having the distinctions of these two traditions. And so at the age of 40, Moses is not a young boy. He is a grown man. And so at this point in his life, when he makes this decision, when he says, I refuse to be called the son of the daughter of Pharaoh, Moses is making a decision that will pretty much affect his life. Because at this point, we could also say that Moses is at a point where the danger of succumbing to the pleasures of his youth was not something that would sway his decision. He was basically grown, a mature man. And so he makes this decision, right? And we see that in Exodus 2, verse 9. Seemingly, he was adopted by the daughter of Moses. So let me ask this question. What experiences does Moses growing up in the household of Pharaoh gives him in comparison to the Israelites? What advantages does he have as growing in the household of Pharaoh? Yes, Jay.
Some training in leadership, right? He would have understood how government would work, which
Yes.
of course would prepare him to lead the Israelites in the future.
That's right. That's perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for, because Moses, growing up in the household of Pharaoh, gives him access to wealth. It gives him access to leadership. In fact, he could have very well been the next heir to the throne. But barring all of that, he makes a decision, and he says, I refuse to be called the son of the daughter of Pharaoh. Yes. And also, one thing that held him, that he had, was he was educated. Now, as we all know, the Israelites were under slavery. They were beaten. They were oppressed. And he makes a decision that I'm going to be with these people that are being cast into slavery. These people that don't have much, they're in despair. That's who I want to identify myself with. And so, yes.
And also, I think that he had an advantage of, not only did he have that side of the well, he had the other, because the history was back then that the mother didn't really take care of the child, a nanny did, and that was his mother from a small. Why wouldn't it? And I don't know this speculation. She probably remained being his caretaker up through the years, and she could have been teaching him the other side. So, and even then, we know it from the age of 6 or 7 is where you teach people, the kids, so much that they would take with them the rest of their life.
I'm glad you brought that up because I actually didn't know that, but I think up until this point, he must have known that there was a time coming and he had made a choice, whether to make a decision to stay in the household of Pharaoh or to go and be with the Israelites, which very well his mother could have told him that one day our people are to be taken out of this land into the land that is promised to us, covenant that was made to Abram. So that's a great point. Thank you. Anybody has any thoughts, any comments?
It also shows that we shouldn't ostracize ourselves from society as a whole.
That's right.
Because he grew up, as the Bible says, in the world, not of it. He was in it, but he wasn't. And so we should use all the advantages of society we grew up in, education, money, wealth, whatever, to use that to also help in keeping God's children.
That's an excellent point. And I think that brings me to this point that I want to make, and that is Moses knowing, having all this experience or education. I mean, he had access to riches and everything, wealth. He decided to give all of that up. See, for us, what does that mean? I think for us, it means that at one point, when we come into contact with God, that we also have to make a decision. Are we willing to give up everything? That decision we have to make, something that we have to wrestle with. And so that is the point that the Hebrew writer is trying to make when he says, by faith, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Any further comments? Yes.
We know in Romans 10:17, it tells us that faith comes from hearing the word of God. And so this was a time period where we're not given all the details, but the fact that it says Moses did these things by faith, it infers and implies that he obviously had some kind of message from God that tells him what he needed to do.
Yes.
And so he's following through on that message. We're not told specifically what God told him, when God told him to do things. But obviously, he had to have been told that you're the man that's going to lead my people out of bondage. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done some of the things that he did. So I think that's the significance there, is that all of these verses, by faith, they did this, by faith, they did that. It wasn't some wild speculation on their part that, well, God might be doing this or God might be doing that.
That's right.
It was based on God's word, which goes back to verse 1 of the chapter. Faith is based on evidence. It's based on substance. It's based on testimony.
That's right.
It's based on sure teaching from God. And when we believe that and do it, then we produce faith.
That point is excellent, and I think what I want to add to that is the account where he goes out and he sees an Egyptian beating a slave, and he strikes that slave. I think in his mind, he must have known that the promise of God was that these people are to be led out of this land. And so he was thinking that he was actually there trying to help out, right? But we later find out that the people didn't receive it the way that he intended. So all along, he must have known that something or God had a plan for him, and that probably was to help these people leave.
It goes even more than that, because in Acts chapter 7, verse 25, after he struck down the Egyptians, he said, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. So the nation of Israel had been taught that there was a Redeemer coming.
Yes.
And they still didn't see the Redeemer. And similar to Jesus. Israel was taught that they didn't see Jesus coming. In the same way.
I'm going to hold off on that thought because this is coming up. It's coming up. Thank you, Keith. Okay, so let's move further along to verse 25. Okay, so it says, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. First of all, well, we just learned that he chose to be with the people of God. He chooses to be with the Israelites who are in slavery. And so rather, instead of having these pleasures, he's choosing to be with them. And in so doing, he's avoiding the pursuit of pleasure. Because when you think about it, if he's growing up in this rich pagan monarch, he has access to everything that he could have ever asked for. So let me ask this question. What is sin? Because in Greek translation of sin, there's different variations. And hamartia is to miss the mark. An act of disobedience to divine law is hamartima, which is another variation of it. See, for those who seek the path of sin, sin to them might appear in a way pleasing. They might find enjoyment in that. But when you sin, is in a way you are separating yourself from God. When we sin, we are getting rid of, in a sense, we don't have faith. The faith that we have in God is gone. When we indulge in sin, ultimately it leads to death. And so for Moses, sin could have been seen as a temporary thing, because when we live on earth, the time that we have on earth is our time to sin. And so if we allow ourselves to indulge in sin, what does that mean? That means that we are not looking for the heavenly blessing, but rather the earthly blessings, the temporary pleasures of this earth. Life is too short, and I think that when you constantly indulge in sin, is basically you are constantly, in a way, you are putting, you are destroying your central nervous system. You know, they're saying that people, or those that are keen to the pleasures, are the ones that die prematurely. And so the point that I want to make is that when we sin against God, indeed we're sinning against ourselves too. Our bodies are meant to be holy. Just like a car, you know, when you have a car, you want to take care of it and you want to make sure that it functions properly. So too is our body. Our body is meant to be holy. 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin a person commits is outside of the body, but a moral person sins against his own body. The point that I want us to get from this is that we are to choose to pursue a life of being holy, fleeing from sin, because Moses chooses that same path. He says that I'm not going to live in this world and enjoy these pleasures. I'm going to be with my people. And in Thessalonians 3:13 says, so that your hearts are strengthened in holiness to be blameless before God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his saints. Does anyone have any comments or any remarks? Perfect. Okay, so let's move further along. Verse 26 says, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. I think this verse, when I stumbled on it, was a little bit hard for me to understand, because it could be open to different interpretations. But allow me to ask this question, because some might misunderstand this verse because of the word reproach. So what is reproach? To feel a sense of reproach is to feel disapproved or disappointment or suffering or rejection. So the point that the Hebrew writer is trying to make here is Moses says, instead of having acceptance, instead of having suffering, instead of having understanding, instead of having all the things that comes with being in the house of Pharaoh, I want to be with the people of Israelites. I choose rejection. I choose trials. I choose to be with his people whom very well are eventually not going to understand what he was meant to do. And so that is the point that the author is trying to make here. Does anybody have any thoughts or any comments that they want to add? Yes.
You know, I think this is a little bit of a continuation of your lesson last week.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph all understood the covenant that God made with Abraham. There's a couple different times where God kind of spoke with Abraham. You know, in 15, chapter 15, God says, hey, your offspring will be sojourners.
That's right.
In another land for 400 years, and the fourth generation, when the sins of the Amorites is full, I'll bring you back. I think Moses knows this.
That's right.
Just like from your lesson last week, you know, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph knew that. Mm-hmm. And I think they also understood, even if they didn't fully understand Christ, they understood through their father, Abraham, that all the generations of earth would be blessed through his seed. I think they don't necessarily know Christ, but they know that this is all about God's people. And if you go back to the one verse, back to 25, here it says he chose to be mistreated with the people of God. He didn't just say, you know, the Israelites.
That's right. That's right.
Or like his people. No, it's the people of God. And I think he's just like, you know, Jacob from your lesson last week is looking for that greater reward.
That's an excellent point. And I think the point that I want to touch on too is the fact that Moses must have, like you said, believed that there was a coming of a Messiah. And so when he says that he's considered a reproach of Christ's greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, he's very well saying that I want to associate myself with the people of God because I know the promises of God that he is one day going to give them the land of the Canaan. And so with that, he also knows that there is a coming of the Messiah, and his endurance is a life full of rejection. It's a life full of destruction. And so he's saying that is the promises of God for these people is far more important than anything that this world has to offer. Does that kind of, yes. Yes.
I don't know who said it first, but I think this boils down in my mind to one line. Moses made this decision, which is the very same decision I have to make, and that is don't ever give up what you want most for what you want now. That's
excellent. Don't ever give up what you want most for what you want now. Man, I need to write that down. That's excellent.
We do a misdeed by not teaching this when we teach people the gospel. Because we teach people the gospel at the point of now everything is okay. And things are going to get better for you. But if we did this, from a young child, he was taught there's going to be persecution if I stay with the people of God.
That's right.
And so we need to teach that side of it too when we teach them the gospel. We tell them things are going to be tough for you because you're not going to be part of the world. So they'll be prepared. And maybe that's why when people fall away, because they hear the word of God, you're not prepared when hard times come.
And that's the same thing, towards the end it says, for he was looking for a reward. What was the reward? It was not of this earth, but just like Abraham was looking for a heavenly home, a city that was built by God. So thank you for that. Okay, so verse 27 says, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of anger of the king, for he endured seeing him who is invisible. If you would you please turn with me to Exodus 2, verse 11 through 16. And can I have someone read Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 through 16? And here we see an account of when he leaves Egypt.
11 through 16.
Yes, verse 2, verse 11 through 16.
Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And he went out the second day, behold, two Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now when the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock.
Thank you, Keith. And I want to ask this question because evidently we see him leaving Egypt when he finds out that they know what he had done. And in fact, Pharaoh was trying to find him so he could kill him. And so he travels, and I put a map there where it shows him leaving from Egypt, and he travels through the wilderness into a place called Midian. And when he gets to Midian, what happens? He saves a group of women, and they go back and tell their father, and he eventually becomes, the father becomes Moses' father-in-law, and he has children, and then he actually finds his way back in the wilderness, and that is where God appears to Moses, and he tells him to go back. And so in this verse, is the Hebrew writer wrong? Is he referring to the first departure of Moses when he was afraid? Is that what he's referring to here? Is that what the Hebrew writer is trying to reference, that Moses was afraid in this particular context? The answer is no. He's actually referring to the second departure of Moses, because as we know, there was plagues, and afterwards the people of Israelites were taken out of the land of Egypt, and they made their way through the wilderness all the way down into the Red Sea. So the author here is saying that Moses, after everything, after the signs that he had seen, at that point, there is not a doubt that in his mind that he was afraid of Pharaoh. He was not. Because of the signs that God had put in his life, the miracles, the trials, the tribulations that he went through, that he was not afraid. And so throughout this process, we learned that he comes into contact. Not that he had seen God, but he had come into contact with God. He had a relationship with God. God was his friend. And so that, when the author says, for he had endured seeing who is invisible, that is actually the definition of faith. Because what is faith? What is faith? Faith, in Hebrews 11, verse 1 says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Moses had seen all these things, and so in that moment, he was faithful. Because for me, faith is God has a promise for me. It may not be that the promise will be fulfilled while I'm alive, but I have faith that God will indeed fulfill the promise. That is faith. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes.
When you put it as you just did, it made me realize that here we're talking about the faith of Moses, and by extension, the faith that hopefully we would have. But your statement reminds me that God himself is actually faithful. Yes. That God keeps his promise. And it's because of that that our faith is actually substantiated, supported. Right? Our faith is made valid because God was faithful first.
That's an excellent point. God is, when we are faithful, God is also always faithful to us. And we've seen so many examples of that, where he's faithful to us, even when we are not faithful to him. So thank you. That was a great. So we're running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and skip over to verse 28 through 29. It's a typo there. It says, by faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. Now, let me ask this question. What is the Passover? Does anybody know what the Passover is? Yes. So we learn in Exodus 12, 22 to 23, that there were the plagues because God had hardened the heart of Pharaoh and he wouldn't let them go. And so the 10th plague was the Passover, where he asked Moses to tell the people to kill a lamb and a goat and to sprinkle the blood on the lintel of the ceiling of the houses. And those that did not do that, when the angel of God came to strike down the firstborn sons, that it would skip over them, and they were to have a meal the night of. Right? So that is the Passover. And so quickly, let me also make this point, and that is when this happens, it says, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea on a dry line. But before that, I want to quickly make a reference to that verse 28 by a commentator, and says, the faith in this case was confidence that this will be the means of preserving the firstborn sons of the Israelites when the angel should destroy the firstborn of the Egyptians, and also it will be celebrated as perpetual memorial of this great deliverance. So we learn in the past that the firstborn sons of the Hebrews were being killed. And so this plague also represents the preservation of the firstborn sons of Israel as they are in a process of being taken out of the land of Egypt into Canaan. And so that is a point there that I want us to concentrate on. And then lastly, by faith, the people crossed the Red Sea on dry land. But Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. This is also a contrast between the faith of the Israelites as opposed to the Egyptians. Because when the Israelites, the chosen people of God, were trying to cross the Red Sea, when God told Moses, strike the water with your staff, and it opened up and they walked through, they were not harmed. The waters didn't return. But when the Egyptians did the same, what happened? They died. And that is the difference between those that are the people of God. When we have faith in God, he is going to protect us. And if we don't live a life that is pleasing to God, that we could fall into death. So that is a point that I want to make. And lastly, I know we run out of time. I wanted to leave a couple of things with you, and that is, as this week, as I was preparing for my lesson, I took time to reflect. And I realized something, and that is that I spent some time just talking to God. And I know we all pray, but this time I wanted to talk to God, and I wanted to know, God, where am I? Do I have a relationship with you? And so as I was thinking about that, I was like, man, all these patriarchs had a relationship. They were friends of God. So my question for you this week, or my challenge, is to spend time this week and just talk to God and just have a relationship with God, have an intimate relationship with God, because that ultimately was what these patriarchs had. They had a friendship with God. And so I challenge you to do the same. Ask God, how is my relationship with you? Because the only way that you can please God, the only way that we can live by faith, is by spending time in his word. And then also I want you to think about this parts of this study that you felt challenged. And so my part is done, and next week Matt will pick up. Does anybody have any closing comments or thoughts? Yes, Jack.
we're in the army of God, and we have to go through some basic training. And when I was first converted, I was very impetuous and many times stuck my foot in my mouth. But God brought me to the right conclusions after a while. But I made mistakes, and it drove me to think that I needed to go to Bible college so I know what I was talking about. And Moses had to go into the wilderness for a while. God, he could come to God, and God could bring him where he needed to be.
That's right.
And so we don't all change overnight. We might have faith, but it takes time to change us.
That's right.
God works on us providentially through his word, through the preaching of the gospel, and through prayer, and through battle.
That's right. Jack said that, we have faith, but it takes time. And just like you said, Moses, I'm actually going to go back and see how he ended up in that wilderness again, and what was his mindset that drove him to get there. So that is all that I have. Does anybody have any other comments before we close? That's it. Thank you. Thank you so much.